The morning sun hit the marble like judgment. Corinne stood on the terrace of their Malibu compound, her third mimosa sweating in a crystal flute, and scrolled through her Instagram with the methodical precision of a woman who turned validation into a full-time job. 217 comments on her last post, a carousel of her in a white Hermes bikini, captioned, "Living my best life sparkles," and she hadn't even liked half of them yet. "Ungrateful people," she muttered, taking another sip. The champagne was Dom Perignon 2008, the kind that cost more than most people's car payments. It tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing these days. Marcus appeared behind her. She heard his Italian loafers on the marble before she saw him, and wrapped his arms around her waist. His Rolex caught the light, that same $400,000 watch he'd bought her last month before she demanded the newer model. He smelled like the private golf course, like money and sunscreen and the particular cologne that only hedge fund managers wore. "You're beautiful," he said into her hair. She didn't turn around. "I know." It had been like this for 8 years. The compliments arrived like clockwork. The gifts were predictable now: jewelry, cars, the renovation of the guest house that they never used because, as Marcus said, why would we need guests when we have each other? The sex was efficient. Wednesday nights usually, sometimes Saturday mornings. He was always careful, always considerate, always leaving her feeling like she'd just completed a transaction rather than experienced a moment of genuine connection. Corinne had married Marcus for exactly one reason. He was rich. Specifically, he had been the richest man at the party where they'd met 7 years ago, a charity gala she'd attended wearing a dress she'd borrowed from a friend and a lie about working in marketing. She'd positioned herself by the silent auction, laughed at his jokes even though they weren't funny, and worn the expression of a woman who found him fascinating when, in truth, she found everything about him exactly average except for his net worth. He'd proposed 3 months later with a diamond that required its own insurance policy. She'd said yes before he finished the sentence. Now, 8 years into their marriage, Corinne had everything a woman was supposed to want and absolutely nothing she actually needed. The mansion was immaculate. The staff kept it that way. Her body was maintained by trainers and surgeons. Her wardrobe rotated through brands that most people only saw in magazines. She had time, endless, suffocating time, and money and freedom, and the distinct sensation of drowning in champagne. "Let's go to Aspen," Marcus said, finally moving away. "I'm tired of the beach." "You hate the mountains." "I hate anything longer than a week." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd never been told no. "But you like them, so we'll go." This was his love language, not affection, not presence, compliance with her preferences, as if her happiness could be purchased rather than earned. Corinne turned to look at him properly for the first time that morning. Marcus was handsome in an obvious way, the kind of handsome that came from expensive haircuts and cosmetic dentistry and personal trainers. He was 48 but looked 35. He wore his power like cologne. Everything about him was carefully constructed, perfectly maintained, and absolutely hollow. "I don't want to go to Aspen," she said. His expression flickered, confusion mostly. Marcus rarely encountered resistance. "Okay, where do you want to go?" She didn't have an answer. That was the problem. She didn't want to go anywhere. She didn't want anything. Want had become a function she'd lost the ability to perform. "I don't know," she said. "Surprise me." He laughed, a real laugh which was somehow worse than his practiced ones. "You don't like surprises. Remember Barcelona, you cried." "That was different." "How?" Corinne opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have an explanation that wouldn't sound ungrateful. The truth was, she'd cried in Barcelona because she'd realized, somewhere between the Sagrada Familia and the beachside dinner at a 3-star Michelin restaurant, that none of it mattered. The beauty of the city couldn't touch her. The luxury of the experience couldn't move her. She was a ghost haunting her own life, and even the most perfect moments felt like they were happening to someone else. "Just forget it," she said. "I'm being dramatic." Marcus kissed the top of her head. "You're being Corinne." He said it fondly, like it was a cute character trait, like her emotional numbness was endearing. "I'm going to the club," he said. "Back around 6. We're meeting the Hendersons for dinner at Nabu. I had Patricia confirm." Patricia was his assistant. Everything in their life was confirmed by Patricia: reservations, social engagements, the exact thread count of the Egyptian cotton sheets on their bed. Corinne nodded and turned back to her mimosa and her phone. She heard his loafers retreat across the marble, heard the electric hum of the garage door opening, heard the growl of his Range Rover pulling out of the driveway. It was exactly 10:47. He would be back at 6:15 p.m., give or take 3 minutes. He would shower. He would change into something from his closet of identical designer suits. He would compliment her appearance. They would go to dinner with the Hendersons, who were as empty and beautiful as they were, and they would perform the ritual of their lives. And nothing would ever change. Karen set down her phone and looked out at the pool. It was an infinity pool designed to look as if it spilled directly into the Pacific Ocean below. The water was perfectly chlorinated, perfectly blue, perfectly still. She'd never learned to swim properly. Marcus had suggested lessons years ago, but she declined. Water made her nervous. The way it had no bottom, no edges, no solid structure, it reminded her too much of her own interior landscape. The house was quiet now. The staff had taken the day off. It was just her, the marble, the silence, and the growing sense that she'd made a catastrophic mistake somewhere around 8 years ago, but she couldn't go back and find where. She finished the mimosa and made another one. This time she poured the champagne first, filling the flute almost entirely. The orange juice came later, watering things down. She told herself she was being healthier. The truth was simpler. She was trying to numb something that champagne couldn't quite reach. At 2:34 p.m., the intercom buzzed. Karen almost didn't answer it. Visitors were rare. Marcus managed the social calendar like a general managing a battlefield, and unannounced guests were considered a form of aggression. She pressed the button anyway. Yes. Delivery for Mr. and Mrs. Chen, a male voice came through. From Marina Luxury Motors. Karen's heart did something strange in her chest. Marcus hadn't mentioned a delivery. Marcus planned everything. He didn't make spontaneous moves. Spontaneity was inefficient. I'll be right down, she said. She looked at herself in the mirror as she passed. She was wearing a juicy couture tracksuit in cream, vintage now, therefore expensive, and her face was arranged in the particular expression of someone who'd had moderate success with Botox. She looked like what she was, a beautiful woman who'd never had to work for anything, which meant she'd never had to want anything, which meant she'd never actually become anything at all. The driveway was long and curved, lined with palm trees that the landscaper had planted according to exact specifications. At the bottom in front of the house, a man in a dark suit stood next to the most beautiful thing Karen had ever seen. The Lamborghini Huracan was the color of fresh blood, not metaphorical blood, actual blood, deep, dark wine red, the kind of color that suggested violence and luxury in exactly equal measure. Chrome caught the sunlight like it was angry at the sky. The wheels were black and enormous, the kind of wheels that promised speed and danger and the distinct probability of death. Mrs. Chen, the man asked. Yes, Karen breathed, unable to look away from the car. Your husband purchased this vehicle 3 months ago, the man said. He's had it customized according to his specifications. It arrived at the port this morning. I'm here to deliver it and walk you through the features. 3 months, she tried to do the math, that would be. June, she'd been in Park City in June, a spa week. Alone, Marcus had stayed behind for work, he'd called once. She'd turned off her phone after that. He didn't tell me, Karen said. He wanted it to be a surprise, the man said, and his expression suggested that this was the kind of surprise that men like Marcus gave women like Karen, and that gratitude was the only appropriate response. She walked toward the car like it was a person she was meeting for the first time. The paint was so flawless it looked liquid. She could see her reflection in the hood, distorted, magnified, somehow more real than she actually was. It has a 5.2-liter V10 engine, the man was saying. 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds, top speed of 201 miles per hour. The interior is hand-stitched Italian leather. The sound system is. Can I drive it? Karen interrupted. The man looked surprised. Your husband said you might not want to. He mentioned you were nervous about driving performance vehicles. Karen didn't remember telling Marcus that, though she probably had. She told him most things, and he filed them away like data points, converting her vulnerabilities into limitations she'd have to work around. I want to drive it, she said. He smiled then, the smile of a man who'd been paid extra to be flexible. He handed her the keys. The Lamborghini smelled like leather and possibility. The steering wheel was small and precise. The seats hugged her like they'd been designed specifically for her body. She pressed the ignition button, and the engine came alive with a sound like something wild finally being released from captivity. Just down to the gate and back, the man said. Don't exceed 40 kilometers per hour on the property. Corinne nodded, but she was already imagining other things. She was imagining driving this car to the Pacific Coast Highway. She was imagining opening it up on a straightaway, feeling the acceleration push her back into the seat. She was imagining the moment when something inside her might finally wake up. She reversed out of the driveway carefully, watching the mirrors, aware of the man watching her. The car responded to every tiny adjustment. The power was immediate, overwhelming, intoxicating. She'd never driven anything that wanted to move as badly as this did. At the gate, instead of turning around, she pressed her foot down slightly on the accelerator. The car was already moving forward before she decided to do it. The gate was closing, but not fast enough. She was through before it shut completely, onto the street beyond, toward the Pacific Coast Highway, toward the ocean, toward anything that might make her feel alive again. She drove faster, 60, 80, 100. The road curved along the coastline and the ocean appeared intermittently through the windows, a blue-green reminder that there was something bigger than her carefully constructed life. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Her heart was hammering. She was breaking a rule, violating an expectation, doing something that wasn't part of the plan. She was terrified. She was exhilarated. She was, for the first time in years, actually feeling something. She drove for 3 hours until the sun was starting its descent and her phone was exploding with messages. 12 from Marcus, 6 from Patricia, 4 from a number she didn't recognize. Her hands were aching from gripping the steering wheel. At 5:47 p.m., she turned around and drove home. The man from the dealership was gone. The driveway was empty except for her car. She parked the Lamborghini in its original spot, exactly centered, and went inside to find Marcus waiting in the living room, still in his golf clothes, his face arranged into an expression of controlled fury. "Where the fuck were you?" he asked. It was the first truly strong emotion she'd heard from him in months, maybe years. "Driving," she said. "You took delivery of a car worth $380,000 without permission and disappeared for 3 hours," he said. "Patricia called the dealership. They said you never came back. I thought you'd been in an accident. I thought you were dead." Corinne wanted to apologize. She wanted to smooth this over, perform the ritual of making him feel better. She wanted to do what she'd been doing for 8 years, compress herself into whatever shape he needed her to be. Instead, she said, "Thank you for the car." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not anger anymore, something colder. "You're welcome," he said finally. "Dinner is at 8, don't be late." But they both knew something had changed. She'd taken the car without asking. She'd driven away from him. She'd made a choice that wasn't part of the script, and in doing so, she'd revealed something he'd probably always suspected, that she was capable of wanting something other than what he'd provided. Every morning after Marcus left, she would run her fingers along the sleek edges of the car, sink into the leather seats, and press the ignition button like it was a key that opened something buried deep inside her. The acceleration never got old. The speed never became routine. It was the only thing in her life that felt honest. A machine that had no pretense, no social hierarchy, no ability to disappoint her because it had never promised her anything except what it was. Fast, powerful, and completely indifferent to her emotional state. Marcus didn't comment on her driving anymore. He'd paid Patricia to call the dealership and register the car in Corinne's name as a legal matter, which was his way of making the surprise official and therefore non-negotiable. But she could see something shifting in how he looked at her. It was like watching a man realize, slowly, that he'd married someone capable of agency. 2 weeks after the delivery, Corinne was driving down the Pacific Coast Highway in the late afternoon, the Lamborghini humming beneath her like a living thing, when she saw him. He was stranded on the shoulder of the road with the hood of an ancient Jeep open and his hands black with engine grease. The Jeep was a relic, late 1980s, held together with duct tape and desperation, and the kind of hope that came from refusal to accept defeat. He was probably in his mid-50s, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outside and didn't obsess over the prevention of wrinkles. Corinne wasn't the kind of woman who stopped for strangers. She wasn't the kind of woman who did anything without calculating the risk and the social appropriateness. But something about the image, this broken-down car, this man who looked like he'd never had $380,000 for a sports car, made her slow down. She pulled over onto the shoulder, and he looked up, surprised, then confused, then something else she couldn't quite read. "You need help?" she asked through the window. "No," he said, not rudely, just factually. "I've got a tow truck coming about 20 minutes. "What's wrong with it?" "Alternator's shot." He wiped his hands on his jeans, which didn't help. They were already filthy. "Story of my life, really. Things breaking down faster than I can fix them." There was something in the way he said it that suggested he wasn't just talking about the Jeep. "I could wait with you," Karen said. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. "You don't have anywhere to be." She thought about the Hendersons' dinner. She thought about Marcus waiting in their living room, expecting her home by 6:00 p.m. She thought about the particular empty perfection of her life, which suddenly seemed like something she might be willing to abandon for the sake of sitting on the shoulder of a highway with a stranger who drove a broken-down Jeep. "Not particularly," she said. She turned off the Lamborghini and got out. The man looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time. Not at her designer clothes or her expensive jewelry or her face that had been arranged by professionals to approximate perfection. At her, whatever that meant. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand. She shook it. His grip was strong and his skin was rough in a way that suggested actual work. "Karen," she said. They stood together in the fatting sunlight, the ocean crashing against the rocks below, the Lamborghini gleaming red like a small, aggressive wound in the landscape. "That's quite a car," he said. "My husband gave it to me. I don't think he intended for me to use it." The words had escaped before she could stop them. She didn't talk about Marcus this way, not to anyone, certainly not to strangers on highways. David didn't seem particularly interested in the gossip. He was looking at the car like he was trying to understand something about it. "Can you drive it?" he asked. "Extremely fast." "But can you? Meaning, do you know how to actually handle that kind of power?" "I'm learning." "That's dangerous," he said. It wasn't a rebuke, just a statement of fact. "What isn't?" she asked back. The tow truck came exactly 20 minutes later, as promised. David directed the driver, gave a number that seemed shockingly reasonable as payment, and climbed into the cab without saying goodbye. Karen watched the Jeep disappear down the highway, wondering if she'd ever see him again, wondering why she cared, wondering what it meant that the most interesting conversation she'd had in years had taken place with a man whose last name she didn't know. She was 3 minutes late for dinner with the Hendersons. Marcus didn't say anything, but he placed his hand on her lower back in a way that was possessive rather than affectionate, and she understood the message. "You belong to me, and showing up late is a form of rebellion I'll address privately." The dinner was like all the other dinners, expensive food that tasted like nothing, conversation that circled endlessly around work, vacation homes, and the particular complaints of wealthy people. Mrs. Henderson spent 15 minutes discussing the difficulty of finding the right yoga instructor. Mr. Henderson talked about his portfolio. Marcus discussed the market with the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything. Karen excused herself to the bathroom and called the dealership. "I need information," she said to the confused person who answered after-hours emergency line. "A man brought in a Jeep today, 1986. It needed an alternator. I need to know his name." "Mrs. Chen, we don't actually service vehicles like." "I need his name," she repeated. There was a pause, then, "I'm sorry, I can't give out customer information." She hung up and felt something crystallize inside her. She wanted to know him. She wanted to know this man who drove a broken car and looked at speed with respect rather than entitlement. She wanted to know what it was like to live a life that wasn't predetermined, that wasn't purchased, that wasn't perfectly arranged and absolutely empty. Over the next 2 weeks, she drove the Pacific Coast Highway every afternoon. She drove slowly at first, looking, then faster, then recklessly, testing the limits of the car and her own nerve. On the 14th day, she saw him again. Or rather, she saw the Jeep, parked near a viewpoint overlooking the ocean, and the man sitting on the hood watching the sunset with the attention of someone who understood that moments like this were rare and should not be wasted. She pulled over behind him and got out. "Hi," she said. He turned, and she watched recognition cross his face, followed by something that looked like resignation, like he'd known this moment was coming and had been preparing for it anyway. "Karen," he said, "fancy meeting you here." "I've been driving this route a lot," she admitted. Looking for me. She could have lied. She could have invented an excuse about the beauty of the coast or the excellent use of the car's capabilities. Instead, she said, yes. He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that suggested actual feeling rather than social performance. That seems like a bad idea, he said. Probably is. I'm not exactly in a position to. I know, she interrupted. I have money, you don't. I'm married, you're not. I drive a car that costs more than your house probably. This is objectively a terrible idea. And yet here you are. And yet here I am. David jumped down from the hood of the Jeep and stood in front of her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes. Laughter lines, mostly, the kind that came from a life lived outside the bounds of perfectionism. What are you doing? He asked. What is this? I don't know, Karen said honestly. But I know that for the first time in years something feels real, and I think maybe you feel the same way. He didn't touch her, not then. He just looked at her with an expression of such complete sadness that it broke something inside her. I do, he said finally. That's the problem. What if I don't care if it's a problem? You should care very much. But he was already leading her back to the viewpoint, to a bench overlooking the ocean, and they sat together as the sun descended toward the water. They didn't touch. They didn't kiss. But they talked, really talked for hours about things that mattered and things that didn't, about the choices they'd made and the people they'd become, and the distinct possibility that they'd both been sleepwalking through their lives for years. When Marcus called at 8:47 p.m., she turned off her phone and didn't turn it back on until she was driving home, when she powered it back up to find 17 messages, each one more furious than the last. She parked the Lamborghini in the garage and went inside to find him waiting with the particular rage of a man who'd never been disobeyed in his life. Where were you? He demanded. Driving. For 6 hours. I needed to think. About what? She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that she didn't love him. She wasn't even sure she liked him. She'd married him for money, and in exchange, he'd married her for decoration, and they'd both called it love because it was easier than admitting the truth. About whether I want to keep living like this, she said. Marcus's face went very still. What does that mean? It means I'm not happy. It means I haven't been happy in years. It means I think there might be something else. He stepped toward her, and for a moment she thought he might hit her. Instead, he said very quietly, If you leave me, I will destroy you. Do you understand? I have lawyers who specialize in this. I have accountants. I have resources. You'll have nothing. Nothing, Karen. You'll be broke and alone, and everyone will know exactly what you are. What am I? She asked. A gold digger who got exactly what she deserved. He turned and walked to his study and closed the door. Karen stood alone in the living room of their beautiful, empty house and felt something like relief. The threat hadn't scared her. Maybe because she'd always known on some level that this was the transaction they'd made. She'd given him beauty and companionship, and he'd given her money and a cage. Now she had to decide which she valued more. Karen met David again the next day at the viewpoint, and this time he kissed her, and it tasted like salt water and consequences and the specific sweetness of doing something she wasn't supposed to do. This is crazy, he said against her mouth. Your husband. I don't care, she said and meant it. You should, you really should. But he pulled her closer anyway, and they made out like teenagers on the bench overlooking the Pacific, and for the first time in years, Karen felt something like desire. Not the efficient, scheduled sex with Marcus. Not the empty performance of intimacy. Real, messy, irrational desire. I want to leave him, she said. David pulled back. You're not thinking clearly, you're infatuated. It's thrilling because it's forbidden, but if you actually leave him, you'll lose everything. I have everything and I have nothing, Karen said, and I'd rather have nothing and you than everything and him. You say that now. I mean it now, which is more than I can say for anything I've said to Marcus in the last 8 years. Over the next week, they met at the viewpoint every afternoon. They talked, they kissed. They made plans that ranged from the practical to the absurdly romantic. David talked about his work as a freelance mechanic. He fixed things for people who couldn't afford the dealerships, fixed things because he liked solving problems, like the tangible satisfaction of a broken thing made functional again. He had a small house in a beach town an hour north, nothing fancy. A place with a working kitchen, and a view of the ocean and room for someone if she wanted to stay. I have to leave him properly, Karen said. I can't just run away. He'll hunt me. He'll make my life impossible. I need a lawyer. You need money for a lawyer. I have money, she said. That's the one thing I have. I have jewelry he gave me, accounts he doesn't know about, cash I've been accumulating. I could hire the best divorce attorney in California. And then I take what I deserve and I disappear. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be operating under the assumption that her temporary rebellion would pass. He became more attentive in his way, surprising her with jewelry she didn't want, taking her to dinners she didn't enjoy, having sex with her on schedule while she lay beneath him thinking about David's hands, rough and capable, so different from Marcus's careful, controlled touch. On the 8th day, Karen met with Patricia at a coffee shop near the house. Patricia was Marcus's assistant, efficient, loyal, and fundamentally incapable of asking questions. She'd scheduled every moment of Karen's life for 8 years. I need a favor, Karen said. Of course, Patricia replied immediately. I need you to help me gather documentation. Bank statements, transfer records, anything that shows assets Marcus acquired during our marriage. I need to know exactly what I'm entitled to. Patricia's expression didn't change, but her fingers stopped moving across her phone. I can't do that, she said quietly. That would be a betrayal of Mr. Chen's trust. He's not your husband. You don't owe him that loyalty. I work for him, and I'm asking you to help me not end up poor and alone. Patricia looked away. There are things you don't understand about your husband. What things? Just things. Trust me when I say that you should reconsider whatever you're planning. Patricia, what are you talking about? But Patricia was already standing, leaving cash for her coffee on the table, preparing to leave. Be careful, she said. Please, for your own sake, just be careful. That night, Karen hired a divorce attorney named Richard Brennan, who specialized in high-asset cases and had the particular demeanor of a man who destroyed enough marriages to understand both sides of the equation. She told him everything: the finances, the prenup Marcus had insisted on, the specific ways he'd isolated her from her own life. You're in a difficult position, Richard said without inflection. That prenup is ironclad, and your husband has been very careful about the structure of his wealth. Most of his money is in offshore accounts and complex corporate structures. Getting half of that will be nearly impossible. I don't want half, Karen said. I just want enough to not be destroyed. That depends on how he chooses to play it, Richard said. Some men accept the end of their marriage and move forward. Others try to make sure their ex-wife suffers. From what you're describing, your husband sounds like the latter. Karen knew he was right. Marcus didn't handle loss. When the market had dipped in 2020, she'd watched him work 18-hour days, consumed by rage at the people who'd outmaneuvered him. When someone had backed out of a deal in 2019, he'd spent 6 months finding ways to ensure that person's business failed. He was the kind of man who couldn't let a wound be anything other than an opportunity for revenge. File the papers, she said. Do it fast before he knows it's coming. That's not typically how this works, usually. I don't care how it typically works. He'll mobilize everything he has if he knows it's coming. If you file it fast, at least I'll have the advantage of surprise. Richard looked at her with something approaching respect. Okay, I'll have the papers drawn up by tomorrow. You'll need to sign, and then I can file first thing Friday morning. But after that, all hell breaks loose. You understand that? She did. She understood that once she filed, Marcus would know about David. He would hire investigators. He would try to paint her as crazy or unfaithful or both. He would make sure everyone they knew understood that she'd betrayed him. I understand, she said. Do it anyway. On Thursday evening, David was waiting at the viewpoint with his old Jeep packed with his belongings. I thought we could leave tonight, he said. Go to my place, just leave. Not yet, Karen said. I need to be smart about this. I'm filing papers tomorrow. Once I do, he's going to start making moves. But if I'm smart, if I'm careful, I can walk away with enough money to start over. I can do this properly. Or he could hurt you. He won't. He's all about control, but he stays within the law. He'll sue. He'll fight, but he won't hurt me physically. David pulled her close. I don't trust that. Then trust that I know him better than anyone. Friday morning, Richard filed the papers. By noon, Karen's phone was ringing with calls from Marcus's lawyers. By one, Marcus was on her phone, his voice a controlled fury she'd never quite heard before. "What the fuck are you doing?" he asked quietly. "Something I should have done a long time ago. You're making a mistake, Corinne, a very serious mistake." "I don't think so." "That man you're seeing, the mechanic, the loser in the broken-down Jeep, do you really think this ends with you two living some happy little life? Do you know who he is?" Corinne's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "His name is David Marcus. He's a career con man. He targets wealthy women, befriends them, and then convinces them to leave their husbands. Once they're alone and vulnerable, he disappears with as much of their money as he can access. The last woman he did this to lost $1.7 million. The one before that took her own life 3 months after he left." "You're lying," Corinne said, but doubt was already seeping into her chest like water into a sinking ship. "Check for yourself. David Marcus, born 1969, arrested in 2003 for fraud. Google his name, see what you find." She did, and she found pictures of him, younger but unmistakably him, with different women in different cities over the last 20 years. And she found news articles about a woman named Catherine Hutchins who'd hired him to help her leave her husband, who'd given him $400,000 in liquid assets, who'd gone missing in 2019. And she found a police report confirming that, yes, David Marcus was wanted for questioning in relation to at least 6 cases of financial fraud involving affluent women. The room tilted, the phone fell from her hands. By the time she managed to call Richard, she was barely coherent. "He's a con man," she said. "Marcus was right, he's a con man. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to strongly advise you to stop any contact with this man immediately. And I'm going to contact law enforcement. You should prepare yourself for the possibility of—" She hung up and called David. He didn't pick up. She tried again and again and again. By evening, his phone was disconnected. She drove to the viewpoint, but the Jeep wasn't there. She drove to the address he'd mentioned, a small house in a beach town an hour north, but when she arrived, she found only an empty lot and a sign announcing future development. It had all been a lie. The entire thing. Every conversation, every moment of connection, every promise of something real. It had all been part of a con so perfectly executed that she'd walked directly into it. She'd been so desperate to feel something other than numb, so willing to believe that someone could want her for herself rather than her money, that she'd ignored every warning sign and convinced herself to trust a man she barely knew. She sat in the Lamborghini in the parking lot and called her lawyer. "We need to stop the divorce," she said. "Mrs. Chen, I really don't advise." "Stop it now. Tell them I'm withdrawing the petition." It took 3 days for the paperwork to be filed. 3 days during which Marcus didn't answer her calls or come home. 3 days during which she learned that he'd retained counsel and was proceeding with the divorce whether she wanted to or not. That he'd filed for separation, claiming infidelity. That he was already mobilizing to make sure she received nothing from their marriage. Not the money, not the house, not even the Lamborghini, which he was claiming she'd borrowed without permission and was therefore still his property. The lawyers met in the office of Marcus's attorney, a woman named Sheila Whitmore who specialized in devastation. Corinne arrived with Richard, wearing neutral colors and the expression of someone who'd been thoroughly humbled. She didn't recognize the version of herself that had been constructed by Marcus's legal team, a woman who was shallow, unfaithful, unstable, and gold-digging to her core. "Your client engaged in an extramarital affair with a known criminal," Sheila said, placing a folder on the table with the confidence of someone laying down a winning hand. "She attempted to deceive your husband about the nature of her relationship with this man. And most damning, she attempted to file for divorce under false pretenses, specifically claiming the defendant had engaged in infidelity when, in fact, it was she who was unfaithful." "My client deserves a fair settlement," Richard said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Your client signed a prenup," Sheila replied. "Your client has no case. At best, she walks away with the car and nothing else. At worst, we countersue for the legal fees we've incurred and she ends up owing us money." Corinne felt herself folding. It was easy to fold. It was easier than fighting. It was what she'd been trained to do her entire life, compress herself, smooth things over, become whatever shape was necessary. "The car," she said quietly, "he's claiming the car is his." "The car is registered in your name," Sheila acknowledged. Technically, it's yours, but given the circumstances of its acquisition, a gift from your husband, purchased during your marriage, financed by marital assets, we could argue that it's community property and therefore subject to division. I wouldn't recommend fighting us on it. Richard put his hand on Corinne's arm. Don't say anything, he advised. But Corinne was already standing. I want the car, she said. I don't think you understand, Sheila began. I want the car and I want $500,000 to start over. That's it. I'm not asking for anything else. Not the house, not the investments, not anything. Just the car and the money. Marcus had been silent throughout the meeting, sitting in the back corner of the room with his attorney, watching. Now he smiled. She can have the car, he said. Give her the car. Sheila looked at him like he'd made a mistake. Sir, I really don't think. Give her the car, he repeated. And the $500,000, I don't care. There was something in his expression that made Corinne's skin crawl. It was the look of a man who'd already won something greater than money, who was willing to let go of small things because he'd decided to destroy something more important. The agreement was drawn up and signed by end of business that day. By evening, Corinne had transferred into her bank account, and the title to the Lamborghini had been put in her name. By night, she was packing a bag, preparing to leave the house, preparing to disappear before Marcus could do whatever he'd already decided to do. Richard called her at 11 p.m. Don't drive anywhere alone, he said. I know you're upset, but I've seen how your husband works. He's not done yet. He got what he wanted. He's rid of me. Isn't that enough? That's not what this is about for him, Richard said. This is about punishment, about making sure you know exactly what it costs to leave him. What can he do? The divorce is already in motion. The separation agreement is signed. There's nothing left. There's always something left, Richard said quietly. Call me when you're safe, promise me. Corinne hung up and threw clothes into a suitcase. She didn't need much. She had the car, the money, and the address of a motel in a town David had mentioned once, where she could hole up while she figured out what to do next. Maybe go north, maybe south, maybe just drive the Lamborghini until it ran out of gas and see where she ended up. At midnight, Marcus came home. She heard his car in the garage, heard him come inside, heard his footsteps on the marble. She stood in their bedroom holding her packed suitcase like a shield. He appeared in the doorway, still in his tailored suit, still handsome in that cultivated way, still possessing that aura of invulnerability that had attracted her to him 8 years ago. You were planning to leave without saying goodbye, he said. Yes. Just disappear. Take the car, take the money, and vanish. Leave me to explain to our friends why my wife abandoned me. Your wife abandoned you because you're a soulless, empty man, Corinne said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. I stayed for 8 years because I didn't have the courage to admit that I'd made a terrible mistake in marrying you. I'm done now. I'm done being afraid. I'm done performing. I'm leaving. He smiled, that terrible, empty smile. You think you've won something, he said. You think because you have the car and the money that you've gotten away somehow, but you don't understand how this works. You don't understand anything. Then explain it to me. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The money I gave you is marked, he said calmly. Every serial number has been documented. If you try to spend it, law enforcement will know. If you try to use it to start a new life, you'll be arrested for receiving stolen property. That's not legal, Corinne said, but her voice wavered. Neither was your relationship with the con man. But that didn't stop you, did it? Your lawyer was just contacted by a private investigator I hired. We have photographs of you with David Marcus. We have evidence of financial discussions. We have everything we need to argue that you attempted to defraud me of assets in order to run away with a criminal. He walked closer to her, and she backed away until she hit the window. The car, he continued, is also marked. The VIN number has been connected to a missing persons investigation involving one of your boyfriend's previous victims. If you drive that car anywhere, if you get pulled over for any reason, you'll be arrested as an accessory to whatever crime David Marcus is currently committing. You're insane, Corinne whispered. I'm thorough, he said. I've spent the last week preparing this very carefully. Everything is in place. By Monday morning, you'll have been contacted by federal agents. By Tuesday, you'll be a co-conspirator in several financial crimes. By Wednesday, everyone will know exactly what kind of person you are. He opened the door to leave, then paused. "You could stay," he said. "You could give the car back, return the money, and we could tell everyone this was a misunderstanding. I'd allow it. I'd forgive you. We could go back to the way things were." Corinne gripped her suitcase and said nothing. "No," he smiled again. "Then I suggest you enjoy your freedom while you have it, because it's going to be very, very brief." He closed the door and she heard his footsteps descend the stairs. She heard him in the kitchen. She heard him on the phone with Patricia, discussing something about the next morning's schedule. He was already moving on, already constructing his next move, already orchestrating the destruction he'd promised. Corinne set down her suitcase and looked at the Lamborghini keys on the bedroom dresser. She thought about the drive to the coast, about the way the car had made her feel alive for those few weeks. She thought about David, the real David, or whatever version of David had actually existed in her imagination, and realized that even her rebellion had been carefully orchestrated by someone else. She picked up the keys and went downstairs. Marcus was in his study on a conference call. He watched her through the glass as she passed, carrying her suitcase. He raised his glass in a mock toast. She loaded her suitcase into the trunk of the Lamborghini. She programmed the GPS for the coast, not the safe route, but the scenic route, the one that wound through the mountains and then descended toward the sea. At 1:47 a.m., she pulled out of the driveway. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't think about the lawyers or the charges or the life she was leaving behind. She thought only about speed and momentum and the specific sensation of point of no return. The mountain roads were empty at that hour. The headlights cut through the darkness. The engine screamed with every acceleration. She was crying big, ugly sobs that she could barely contain, but her hands were steady on the wheel. She drove for 2 hours, until the road descended toward the coast, and the ocean appeared in her headlights like a promise or a threat. She took the exit toward Malibu, toward the neighborhood where Marcus's friends all lived, toward the territory they'd inhabited together for 8 years. The roads in Malibu were private, gated, secured by people hired to keep the world out. She knew them all. She'd been waving at the same guards for 8 years. The guard at the gate of the cliffside estate knew her by sight. She pressed the intercom button at the entrance to the property, and without waiting for an answer, she floored the accelerator. The gate took 2 seconds to register that she was coming. 2 seconds was enough. The Lamborghini was through, racing up the private driveway toward the house that overlooked the sea. She could see the lights on inside. Marcus must have driven here directly after their conversation, must have prepared this moment somehow, must have been waiting. The driveway curved toward the infinity pool, toward the edge of the property, toward the moment where the land ended and nothing but air remained between the car and the rocks below. Corinne didn't slow down. The pool appeared in her headlights like something impossible, all blue water and perfect reflection and the promise of an end to something. She could see Marcus emerge from the house, could see his face register what was happening, could see him run toward her as if he might actually be able to stop a car moving at 70 miles per hour. She screamed, not from fear, from something else entirely, relief, rage, freedom, all of it combined into a single primal sound. The Lamborghini lifted as it crossed the edge of the infinity pool. For a moment, suspended between water and air, Corinne felt completely free. It hit the empty pool with a sound like the world ending, metal shrieking against concrete, glass shattering, the terrible crunch of something violent. The Lamborghini crumpled like paper, the driver's side crushed against the concrete bottom of the pool as the car settled at an angle. The engine cut out. The headlights died, and Corinne hung in the darkness, suspended by the damaged seatbelt, bleeding from a wound on her forehead, very much alive. She hung there for maybe 5 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then she heard Marcus screaming, not at her, but at the people who were already running toward the pool, security guards and staff and neighbors who'd seen the flash of red, heard the crash, understood that something irreversible had just happened. "Call an ambulance," someone was shouting. "Call 911. Corinne unclicked the seatbelt, and gravity did the rest. She fell the remaining distance to the concrete, hitting hard, ribs absorbing the impact, air leaving her lungs in a gasp. She lay there in the darkness of the ruined car, bleeding, broken, absolutely certain that she'd just made the worst possible choice. Except she wasn't dead. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The paramedics who extracted her from the vehicle were professional and efficient and clearly had seen worse. She had broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, lacerations that would require stitches, and a mild concussion. She would recover. Marcus stood at the edge of the pool, his face perfectly composed, giving statements to the police officers who'd arrived on scene. He was the grieving husband. He was shocked. He didn't understand what had gone wrong. He'd tried to warn his wife about her erratic driving. She'd been under such stress. He'd been concerned about her mental health. By the time Karen was loaded into the ambulance, she'd been read her rights. The charges came quickly. Reckless endangerment, destruction of property, driving under the influence. They'd found alcohol in her system, though she barely remembered the mimosas from that morning. An attempted insurance fraud. The Lamborghini was insured for $380,000, and the destruction would net Marcus the full value. She was transported to Cedars-Sinai, placed in the ICU, and processed into the system as a woman who'd attempted to either kill herself or commit some crime she wasn't currently coherent enough to articulate. By morning, 2 detectives were waiting to interview her. Richard, her lawyer, arrived before she could speak to them. "Don't say anything," he advised immediately. "Not a single word until I understand what exactly happened." "I drove the car into the pool," Karen said. "I know, I want to know why." She tried to explain. It came out incoherent. Richard listened, his expression growing more complicated as she talked. "He told you the money was marked," Richard said, "and the car was part of a federal investigation." "Yes." "Did you check this? Did you verify any of it?" "I believed him. He had no reason to lie." "Of course he had a reason to lie," Richard said sharply. "His reason was to make sure you drove the car into the pool, which you just did. What you just did is the single best possible outcome for your husband. You've destroyed a car that was probably worth $380,000 and was insured for the full amount. You've demonstrated exactly the level of instability and recklessness he can point to and claim proves you're unfit for half of his assets. And most importantly, you've created a crime scene that he can now use to prove you're criminally dangerous." Karen stared at him, the full magnitude of her mistake becoming clear. "The federal investigation into the car," Richard continued, "doesn't exist. The marked money doesn't exist. The private investigator photographs he claimed to have, I'm betting if we look, they don't exist either. He lied to you, and you responded by acting in such a completely predictable, completely destructive way that I almost think he'd anticipated this exact sequence of events. So he wanted me to crash the car." "I think he wanted you to do exactly what you did," Richard said grimly. "The question is why, and I think we both know the answer. You were leaving him. You were taking the car and the money, and you were disappearing from his life. That's unacceptable to him. It's not about the car. It's not about the money. It's about you achieving something he couldn't control. So he manufactured a situation that would send you spiraling in exactly this way." "I'm going to go to jail," Karen said. "Probably, yes." She lay back against her pillows, and Richard went to negotiate with the detectives. The charges would likely be reduced. She was clearly in psychological crisis. She'd been manipulated by her husband. There were mitigating circumstances. But jail time was almost certain. By evening, the story had made the news. Wealthy woman crashes $1 million Lamborghini into pool. Local doctor's wife arrested after dangerous stunt. Malibu mansion scandal unfolds. Marcus did several interviews, expressing his concern for his wife's mental state, his hope that she'd receive the help she so desperately needed, his own sense of betrayal and hurt at her infidelity and her attempts to defraud him. The public was sympathetic to him. He was a handsome man who'd married a woman capable of such recklessness. He was a victim of her instability. Nobody was interested in the fact that he'd orchestrated her destruction with the precision of an engineer. Karen spent the next 3 weeks in Cedars-Sinai, healing physically, being evaluated psychologically, waiting for the legal system to determine what to do with her. The prosecutor offered a deal, pleading guilty to reckless endangerment in exchange for dropping the other charges. Richard advised her to take it. She took it. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and psychological evaluation. The judge expressed his concern about her mental health and suggested anger management courses. Marcus attended the sentencing wearing an expression of wounded sympathy, and afterward he gave a brief statement to the press about how he was taking this as a wake-up call and considering intensive therapy for their marriage, though he was prepared for the possibility that his wife was not the person he thought he married. He was a master manipulator. Even his attempts at reconciliation were performances of manipulation. Karen went to live with her mother in Santa Barbara, in a small house on a quiet street, in a life that felt smaller than anything she'd ever inhabited. The courts froze her assets while they determined what portion of the settlement she should actually receive. The $500,000 that Marcus had given her was declared community property and returned to him. The Lamborghini was destroyed, and the insurance company denied the claim due to gross negligence. She was, as Marcus had promised, completely destroyed. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath, something Marcus couldn't anticipate or control. Karen's story, when told correctly, wasn't a story about a wealthy woman losing her mind. It was a story about a man's systematic destruction of a woman who tried to leave him. The paparazzi who turned their attention to her initially shifted their focus when a journalist named Amanda Chen, no relation, began digging into Marcus's history and discovered that he'd done this before. Twice, with two other women in the previous decade. Women who'd tried to leave him, who'd been systematically destroyed by false accusations and financial manipulation and manufactured crises that made them appear unstable, vindictive, or insane. One of those women, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, had attempted suicide after her divorce from Marcus. The other, a woman named Sarah Chen, had moved to New Zealand to escape his reach. None of them had been believed, but taken together their stories formed a pattern. Amanda Chen began publishing a series of investigative pieces about wealthy men and the women they destroyed. Marcus Chen became the centerpiece of the story. His business practices came under scrutiny. His financial dealings were questioned. His relationships with other women were examined. By the time the media had finished with him, Marcus's reputation had been thoroughly destroyed. The irony was exquisite. Karen read the stories from her mother's house in Santa Barbara, and for the first time in months she felt something other than shame. She felt vindicated. She felt seen. She felt like the truth, however late in arriving, was better than the performance of being perfect. She began therapy, real therapy, not the court-ordered kind. She began to understand the ways in which she'd made herself small in order to fit into the space Marcus had provided. She began to forgive herself for being foolish enough to marry him and brave enough, eventually, to try to leave. 3 months after her sentencing, on the anniversary of her first meeting with David at the roadside viewpoint, Karen was driving a 2004 Honda Civic along the Pacific Coast Highway. It wasn't a Lamborghini. It was ordinary and reliable and entirely hers. She saw the Jeep before she saw him. It was parked at the same viewpoint, and David was sitting on the hood watching the sunset. He looked older than she remembered. There were new lines around his eyes. She didn't pull over immediately. She sat in the Honda, watching him, wondering if she was about to repeat the same mistake. Wondering if anyone who'd made the choices she'd made could ever trust her own judgment again. She pulled over anyway. "Hi," she said. David turned, and recognition crossed his face, followed by something like guilt. "Karen," he said, "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry." "Are you?" she asked. "Or are you just sorry you got caught before you could finish what you started?" He climbed down from the Jeep and faced her. He was a con man. She knew that now. He'd targeted her because she was rich and lonely and stupid enough to believe that real connection was possible with a stranger in a driveway. But he was also standing here in front of her, and she wanted to know something. "What's your real name?" she asked. "Your actual real name." He looked at her for a long moment. "David Marcus," he said quietly. "That part was always true." "And the rest?" "The rest was a job. I targeted women in situations similar to yours. I helped them leave their husbands, and I took money as payment. That was the con. You're not the first person I did this to." "The articles," Karen said, "were those real, the women, the money?" "Some of them," he said. "Catherine Hutchins was real. She is dead. But she didn't die because I left her. She died because her husband found her and he killed her. And he killed her daughter. And then he killed himself. The entire thing was a massacre, and I ran because I was afraid of being blamed for it." Karen felt the ground shift beneath her. "What your husband told you," David continued, "about me being a con man, about me targeting you, that part was true. But what I felt for you, the moments we shared at the viewpoint, the possibility of a different life, that part was real too. I can be both things. I have been both things for most of my life." "Why are you telling me this?" Karen asked. Because you crashed a car into a pool to escape the life someone else built for you, David said. And I watched the news and I read the articles and I realized that you'd paid a price for trying to leave. And that seemed unfair. That seemed like you should know that some of what you felt wasn't a con, some of it was real. But not all of it, Karen said. But not all of it, he agreed. Karen looked at him, this man who was capable of both tenderness and deception, and realized that he wasn't fundamentally different from Marcus. They were both users. They were both capable of manipulating her, just in different ways. The only difference was that Marcus had the money to make his manipulation permanent, while David had been improvising with the resources he could access. I'm going to go, Karen said. Okay, David said. But I wanted to know, she continued. I wanted to understand what was real and what wasn't, and I do. And now I'm going to spend the next several years figuring out who I am when someone isn't telling me who to be. She turned to walk back to her Honda, and David called out to her. For what it's worth, he said, I hope you figure it out. I hope you find out what it's like to want something just for yourself, not for someone else. I hope you become the person you were meant to be before people like me came along and ruined it. Karen didn't respond. She got into her Honda and drove away from the viewpoint, away from the ocean, away from the possibility of redemption through romance. She drove back toward her mother's house, toward her small life, toward the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone new. 6 months later, Karen had moved into a small apartment in Santa Barbara, found a job at a community center, and begun the unglamorous work of becoming functional. She wasn't happy yet. Happiness seemed like something that belonged to other people, people who hadn't made the catastrophic choices she'd made. But she was beginning to understand the difference between happiness and peace, she discovered, was something you could build for yourself. The divorce from Marcus was finalized in her favor, though not by much. She received $1.2 million, roughly what the settlement was supposed to have been, plus additional compensation for the fraudulent claims he'd made against her. It wasn't enough to replicate her previous life. It was enough to live quietly, to pay for therapy, to become something other than what she'd been. Marcus had begun his own decline. His business partnerships had dissolved. His reputation had been irrevocably damaged by Amanda Chen's reporting. He'd become what all narcissists eventually become when their supply ran out, invisible. Not in prison, not destroyed in any dramatic way, just quietly no longer relevant to anyone. Karen read about his downfall with mixed feelings. Part of her took satisfaction in it. A larger part of her recognized that she'd spent enough time thinking about him, and that continued satisfaction would mean he was still controlling her thoughts, still the center of her narrative. She was beginning to reclaim that narrative for herself. On a Tuesday morning, a year and a half after driving the Lamborghini into the pool, Karen was volunteering at the community center where she now worked part-time. She was teaching financial literacy classes to people recovering from poverty, homelessness, and abuse. The job paid nothing. It was the most fulfilling work she'd ever done. She recognized him immediately when he walked in. Not David, someone else. A man in his 70s with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He was carrying a used bicycle, asking if anyone could fix it. I can help, Karen said, surprising herself. She didn't know how to fix bicycles, but she knew someone who did. There was a volunteer in the machine shop who fixed things as a matter of principle. She introduced them, and the old man's face lit up with gratitude so pure it made her cry. Not sad tears, but tears of connection, of being needed, of having something to offer. As he left, he thanked her. What's your name? She asked. Tom, he said. You? Karen, she said. He smiled. Well, Karen, you've made my day. This bike is how I get to work. I was worried I'd lost it forever. After he left, Karen sat in the break room of the community center and realized something that she'd been too numb to understand before. She liked helping people. Not performing generosity for social media. Not using charitable donations to purchase status. Actually helping. Actually connecting with humans outside the bounds of transactional relationships. It was a small realization, but it felt enormous. That evening, she received a call from Amanda Chen, the journalist who'd reported on Marcus's behavior. I've been following your story, Amanda said without preamble. I was wondering if you'd be interested in doing an interview, a deeper piece this time, about what it's like to survive systematic manipulation by a wealthy man. Corinne's first instinct was to refuse. She'd spent the last year and a half trying to get away from being a story, trying to become something other than the woman who'd crashed the Lamborghini into the pool. But she thought about the other women, about Jennifer Martinez and Sarah Chen and Catherine Hutchins, about all the women who were currently in relationships with men like Marcus, who didn't understand yet that the problem wasn't them, that their unhappiness wasn't a personal failing, but a response to being fundamentally devalued by someone who treated marriage like a business transaction. "Okay," Corinne said, "I'll do it." The interview took 3 hours. Amanda asked difficult questions, and Corinne answered them with an honesty that felt dangerous, like she was handing her heart to someone and hoping they didn't crush it on air. But Amanda was a good journalist. She understood that this wasn't a story about a woman's failure. It was a story about a woman's survival. It was a story about the slow process of reclaiming your own narrative, one day at a time, one choice at a time. The article was published 2 weeks later. It sparked conversations. Other women came forward with their own stories about wealthy men and the particular devastation of being devalued by someone you'd trusted. 3 of them reached out to Corinne directly, asking for advice on how to leave, how to survive, how to rebuild. Corinne gave them Richard's contact information and offered them something more valuable than advice. She offered them the knowledge that recovery was possible, that you could survive having your life destroyed and still become something better than what you were before. On the 3-year anniversary of the Lamborghini incident, Corinne received a letter from David. He was in Portland now, he said. He'd stopped conning women. He was working with at-risk youth, teaching them practical skills, helping them avoid the paths he'd taken. It wasn't redemption, he wrote. He wasn't naive enough to believe that redemption was possible for someone like him. But it was atonement. It was a way of trying to even out the cosmic scoreboard a little bit. He wrote, "I saw the article you did with Amanda Chen. I've read it 17 times. I wanted to reach out 100 times, but I figured you'd probably prefer I stayed away. So I'm writing this to say I'm sorry, not because I was caught, not because I'm legally required to be, but because the person I was when I met you was fundamentally dishonest, and that dishonesty hurt you, and I have to live with that. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just telling you that I see what I did and I'm trying to do better. I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope you became the person you were trying to become." Corinne read the letter 3 times, then put it in a drawer and didn't open it again. David had his own story to tell now, his own redemption narrative to construct. It didn't have to involve her. 5 years after the Lamborghini incident, Corinne met someone at a farmer's market in Santa Barbara. His name was James. He was a retired teacher who grew heirloom vegetables and was terrible at math but excellent at listening. They started slowly, coffee dates, walks along the beach, conversations that took hours but moved very slowly, never pushing, never demanding, never transactional. It took him 8 months to ask her to dinner. It took another 6 months for him to kiss her. It took 2 years for him to ask her to move in with him. Corinne said yes because she loved him, not because of what he had or what he could provide. It was an entirely different kind of yes than the one she'd given Marcus. This yes came from her center rather than from a place of needing to be rescued or provided for. They bought a small house together with a garden and a view of the mountains. They didn't have children. They didn't need to. They were each other's full life, and it was enough. 10 years after the Lamborghini incident, Corinne was 48 years old, the same age Marcus had been when she tried to escape him. She was working as the director of a nonprofit that helped women recover from financial abuse. She was writing a book about her experiences. She was, for the first time in her entire adult life, exactly where she wanted to be. She and James were sitting on their porch one evening when a news alert came through on her phone. Marcus Chen had suffered a massive heart attack and died. He was 63. He left behind a substantial estate that would go to his next of kin, a sister who lived in Oregon whom he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. Corinne read the notice and felt nothing. That was the most important part. She felt absolutely nothing. Marcus had been the central figure of her narrative for so long, first as her salvation, then as her destruction. And now he was just gone, and her life continued exactly as it had been, unaffected by his absence. That felt like victory. She deleted the alert and took James's hand. They sat together and watched the sun descend toward the ocean, and Corinne thought about the Lamborghini and the pool and the moment when she'd thought that speed and danger were the only things that could make her feel alive. She knew better now. She understood that feeling alive came from connection, from purpose, from the small daily work of building something meaningful with another human being. It came from helping people. It came from being helped. It came from the radical act of wanting something for yourself and not feeling guilty about it. "You're thinking about something," James said. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Corinne replied. And she meant it. Not in the way she'd meant it 10 years ago, when luck meant having money and a beautiful house and a man who bought her expensive cars. She meant it in the way that people mean it when they've actually survived something, when they've actually learned something, when they've actually become someone new. She meant it in the way that only people who have lost everything can truly mean it. The sun set over the mountains, and the sky turned the color of the Lamborghini, blood-red and beautiful and already fading, already becoming something else, already surrendering to the night. Corinne sat with her husband and watched it happen, and she was grateful,